need a fourth chair and was told, no, we don't. You get to stand here. So let me introduce myself. I'm David Ignatius. I am a columnist for the Washington Post, and I'm going to moderate this discussion with our distinguished panelists. You know who they are, but let me briefly say, starting on my left, Bob Hormats, who was Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, everything economic. The Chinese Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Madam Ying, excuse me, and the Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden. So I want to start our discussion. We're going to try to talk for 30 minutes amongst ourselves and then throw it open to all of you. But I want to open by just describing the scene at the state dinner during the state visit to the U.S. of Chinese President Hu Jintao. I was lucky enough to attend the state dinner, and I remember thinking at the end of that evening that all of the talk about our subject tonight is strategic competition, inevitable, might be missing the point that if both sides really work hard, a degree of cooperation is possible. That was an evening that ended with smiles on all sides and a sense that competition, increasing collision was not inevitable. So I want to begin the conversation by asking whether that moment of the Hu Jintao state visit, the agreements that were made, the sense that the relationship between the U.S. and China, and really China and the world was not heading down, whether that was a sign of a real change, a continuing change, or was just an interruption in what is inevitably a world of ever greater competition. And perhaps I could ask the Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister to begin.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank Craig for introducing me to this forum. And I was told this is the forum of the best and brightest across the Atlantic. And I'm not sure if I belong to that group, but I'll try my best. This is quite late hour, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning in Beijing. So if I don't follow the discussions, you know why. About the visit of President Hu Jintao, it was perceived as a very successful visit in China. It was the statement came out covering wide sphere of cooperations. The most important point, I think, the message the president, the two presidents sent to the world is that I think China, U.S. Have agreed that we stand to win working together, and we stand to lose fighting against each other. So the message was that China, U.S. should be in cooperation. There was a very wide agreement on partnership in many fields. At the same time, there was a clear understanding that we have differences. We need to talk about the differences instead of allowing the differences to block the progress of the relationship. So we see very positively the visit.
Bob Hormats, what was your feeling at the end of that state visit? The U.S. had a big agenda of issues. You got some of the things you wanted. I think there was a feeling among many analysts that China wanted the visit to succeed, and so in a sense we had an artificial period in which everything seemed to go right because everybody wanted the visit to work. And then are we now back to normal? And is that, as our question sheet suggested, the new normal, which is of greater competition, greater difficulty, more problems?
Well, I think several points are worth mentioning. One, the state visit itself, I think, was a significant success. I had the opportunity to attend that, and there was also a smaller dinner the night before where the president and President Hu Jintao had a more intimate conversation about these issues. And I think the state visit really crystallized a critical point, which Madame Fu Ying has indicated very well, and that is that these two countries now have come to the conclusion that while there is going to be inevitably strategic competition in some areas, as the title of this panel indicates, there also is going to be, and indeed has to be, a great deal of strategic cooperation. And I think the view, at least the view that I have, and I think is shared widely in the administration, is that there are very few things that we can do, that we can accomplish globally, or that China can accomplish globally, without mutual cooperation between the two countries. That is not to say that there is a G2. Both sides reject the notion of a G2 because other countries need to be involved in trade or financial issues or environmental issues or other issues, but that more and more issues that have to be dealt with globally require some measure of cooperation between China and the United States. The Korean Peninsula, environmental issues, dealing with piracy off the coast of East Africa. A whole range of issues require these two countries to work together. And in the United States, there are schools of thought that say, well, the United States should do everything it can to keep China down. And there are people in China who think that that's the goal of the United States. In fact, the goal of the United States really is to welcome China's greater role in the global system, but also to find, on a strategic basis, ways in which we can work with China as a partner, and that is to develop rules of the system that in many cases already exist, where China can be integrated into the system in a way that enables it not to work against the system, but support the global trading system. If we hadn't had cooperation with China on financial issues during the financial crisis, it would have been much more difficult to deal with the financial crisis. So that increasingly our goal as America has to be to find ways of ensuring, A, that China is integrated smoothly into the global system, and B, that China, given its power, its financial power, its commercial power, its strategic power, becomes a country that supports the stability and the effective functioning of the global system. And I think that China is in the process of doing that, but it's not going to come easily. It requires a lot of negotiations, a lot of cooperation, and a long dialogue.
Carl Bildt, let me ask you to speak to these issues from a European perspective. Bob just mentioned the G2 issue, and I'm sure that's really the G2 fear for Europe, that the U.S. and China are either going to be confronting each other or cooperating, but that Europe, in some ways, will be left out. There was talk over the last year about Chinese help for Europe during Europe's financial crisis, Chinese willingness to make money available, Chinese interest in helping Europe to solve that. But tell us how Europe looks at this rising China and the opportunities and dangers for Europe.
Yes, I was obviously not at the state dinner for President Hu Jintao when he was in Washington, but I happened to be in Washington in the days immediately before, and I was impressed by the way in which the U.S. prior to that visit set out its position in, to a certain extent, even rather stark terms, indicated this is what we think, this is what we believe, to use Chinese wording, American core interest in relationship. But then there was the very, very firm wish to make the visit a success. Because call it strategic rivalry or call it strategic competition, it's strategic change that is caused by the rise of China in different ways. And that needs to be managed. And there the management exercise between the United States and China is of key importance also from the European point of view. I don't think we fear any G2. For the reason that Bob Hormats mentioned, it's simply not possible. There are issues, of course, in East Asia where U.S. is a security actor in a way that Europe is not. But there are other issues where Europe is more of an actor, say the climate issues and others. So the G2, I don't think we fear that. What we see is, of course, the impact of China on virtually every global issue, and accordingly the need to engage with this China. and accordingly the need to manage the global strategic change that is coming with the rise not only of China, although China is the most obvious, but the rise of nations that 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, where they were on the map, but they were not on the economic map, they were not on the political map. They are now part of a very different world. And that requires somewhat of a new attitude when it comes to the relationship and diplomacy. And that's why sort of the management of the relationship with China, which is a difficult management exercise, is so critical both from the European point of view and the American point of view, and I believe the Chinese point of view.
Carl just mentioned change. Obviously, this is a week in which the radical changes that are taking place around the world, but in particular in the Middle East, are on all of our minds. And I just would like to ask, in the context of our subject tonight, as we look at the Middle East, we all obviously worry about the security of energy supplies on which China depends, on which Europe depends, on which the U.S. depends. And so there's a question whether part of the increasing competition that we face with the rising China will be a competition for energy supplies and access to them. Or we wonder, are there ways in which China, the U.S., and Europe could cooperate in finding ways to bring greater stability to the Middle East in this period of great change? And let me ask each of you to just say a few words about that. Fu Ying, why don't you start, please?
I think we are all together in this. If the oil price goes up, both China, U.S., everybody will be affected. So I think China is worried, like everybody else, about what will happen after this, and how far this turbulence in the Middle East will go. How soon we could see the stabilization and see the recovery of the oil supply. So I think I don't see how we could, what is the point of competition between China and U.S.? I think we share a lot in seeing the stable supply of oil and therefore seeing earlier stabilization of the situation, seeing a smooth transition of these countries.
Bob, Hormats, a lot of people in the U.S. would say, if they heard Fu Ying's comment, if what China wants is greater cooperation on issues like energy security and stability in the Middle East, can't we draw China into greater activism and involvement in that? I wonder if there's specific things that you would say in response that the U.S. would like to see in the area of cooperation about energy security. And in the area of cooperation, just in dealing with the enormity of the crisis that's sweeping that region.
Well, I actually have just returned from several days in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and I think there is a view from Washington that working with China and indeed a wide range of other countries in Western Europe and elsewhere is important to stabilize the environment. And each country will do what it can do best. I mean, the United States is doing certain things that we've seen in Libya. The United States is preparing, along with Europe and other countries, programs to support economic stability in Egypt. I think our hope would be that we would be able, in this process, to work with other countries that have the resources to provide at least economic assistance to some of these countries to stabilize their economic outlooks and to create jobs. And that would be foreign assistance. It would be other kinds of financial support. We're at a very early stage in the process, and we haven't developed full-blown strategies for doing this yet. But certainly the stability of Egypt is important to the United States. It's important to Western Europe. And it's important to China, because Egypt really is at the center of much that goes on in the Arab world. So our hope would be that either bilaterally or through groups such as the World Bank and the IMF and other institutions to provide the kind of financial support needed for some of these countries to get through this difficult period, to stabilize their economies, stabilize their political systems, and have more participatory democratic systems as a result of this process, if indeed that's possible. And I think in many countries it is. So we look at China in many ways as a partner in dealing with development issues and a partner in dealing with issues related to strengthening global stability. We don't see China as an adversary, and particularly in this region. And the reason for that is China is very heavily dependent on imported energy, particularly imported oil, also natural gas. And therefore, to the degree that we can work with China to help develop either parallel efforts or common efforts through multilateral institutions to support economic stability in these regions, that's a big plus. Having a partner that has the interests that China does in a stable energy environment and has the resources to put into helping to stabilize the economic environment can be a big asset if we find ways of working together, as we hope to do with China and many other countries for that matter.
Before I come to Carl and Fu Ying, I just want to ask you to respond specifically to one suggestion that Bob Hormats made, which is that as Egypt tries to deal with this transition to a new democracy, it's going to face terrible economic problems. I was in Egypt 2 days ago, and this is an economy that really stopped working for 6 weeks or so. Tourism is off 75%, so the economic crisis there is real. It needs help. Would China be willing to join in some kind of international effort, multilateral effort, to provide economic assistance to Egypt? And does that seem like a good idea to you?
China has been having a fairly big amount of economic interaction with Egypt, and I don't see there's any problem that we don't continue. And for financial and other economic assistance, I can't speak for China, but Egypt has been one of the African countries which had a long relationship with China. But for the transition, well, I have some friends in Egypt who talked a lot with me recently. The two countries have a lot in common. We have both long civilization. We have also lots of emphasis on education. For example, there are lots of similarities. And Egyptians are seeing pouring Chinese tourists coming to Egypt, so they could see that the economy in China is growing. They asked me, is China an option for them? Could the Chinese model work in Egypt? I tend to caution on that. I don't think we can offer a solution for them. They have to find their own way. As you said, the country has great difficulties, but this is a very tenacious people and very highly educated people. I think they should be able to find their own way. I tend to be more optimistic with them as long as the society can be stable. If there's chaos for some time, then the economy will go further down, I think.
I want to come back to that question of chaos and democracy and transition in a minute. But, Carl, let me ask you to speak to the question of how China can be a more effective, a stronger partner in dealing with crises like the one that's unfolding in the Middle East. You're a former UN special envoy to the Balkans. You've dealt with multilateral issues like this. How can that be done better?
There were two striking facts coming out of if we take the Libyan crisis now, without going too deep into that, when it comes to China. The first one was, which was really sensational, that China abstained in the vote on the Security Council. I mean, the conventional wisdom would have been that China would have vetoed something that went so far into what could have been described as only internal development. You could describe this resolution, if you want to, as the breakthrough for the possibility or for the principle of responsibility to protect, if you want to. That is the way it's done by the European Council today. And conventional wisdom, China would veto. China did not. China did abstain. That was significant. Second fact which struck me, we were involved in a massive operation to evacuate EU nationals from Libya when the fighting started, for obvious reasons. But there were far more Chinese nationals evacuated than EU nationals. there were 30,000 Chinese evacuated from Libya. The Chinese Navy sent units to the Mediterranean to assist this. This was something that we were not really aware of, the magnitude of. I saw there are 40,000 Chinese in Algeria. I don't know how many EU citizens there are there, but probably not 40,000. So the Chinese involvement in these states very close to Europe and of significant interest to us is perhaps bigger than we were aware of. And accordingly, the need to engage in a dialogue also with China on how we should manage development here is obviously acute.
I should ask Fu Ying, since Libya has come up, in the last week, China made a very sharp criticism of the military intervention in Libya. After abstaining, as Carl said, there was this very strong language that I think caused concern in Europe and the United States. Maybe you could just briefly explain, as Vice Foreign Minister, China's position and its view on Libya as of right now.
First, I want to mention that we successfully evacuated 36,000 Chinese out of Libya in 8 days. We couldn't have achieved that without the help of the neighboring countries. It was the largest evacuation we've ever done. And it's also a wake-up call to China about the need to protect our citizens, the complicated situation we will be in at time of crisis, since so many Chinese are going abroad. There are over 1 million Egyptians in Libya. I think Libya has lots of foreign nationals. You mentioned Algeria. There are lots of foreign nationals as well. So it shows that this world is really interdependent. People are moving around more freely, and therefore the consulate affairs have become more complicated. But come back to UN resolution. It was very difficult. It's very hard for China to agree to a military intervention in any situation in international affairs. We cannot accept. We don't think it works. We haven't seen very successful military intervention in the past, so we do not want to support this kind of action. We don't want to be part of it. But we stayed away from blocking it mainly because the Arab League and African Union, those countries have strong feeling about it, and China has never vetoed against the interests of developing countries. So that was why then, with lots of difficult discussions, we decided to stay away, to abstain.
Bob Hormats, I'm sure at the State Department, the Chinese statement this week was sharply critical of a UN-endorsed military operation, caused a lot of concern. Maybe you could just speak to where the State Department is and what the concerns were after the Chinese statement.
Well, I think I'll let the Chinese statement speak for itself and not try to characterize it. But let me just say that our view in the way this was put together initially in the UN was to have a lot of consultations with a lot of countries on the Security Council, but also countries not on the Security Council. We were, I think, gratified by the fact that some countries who might otherwise have voted no abstained, which helped us to do what the Arab League and the African Union both thought was needed to provide the wording that was in the resolution, which is now being implemented. But I think this is a broader point, and that is that one of the reasons that China is important, and I want to extend this beyond what's happening in North Africa, is to say that increasingly China, which initially was focused primarily on East Asia, is now a country that has a much broader global view of its strategic interests, and is playing a role, not just as a permanent member of the Security Council, which is very important, but China has a global role which 10, 15 years ago it didn't have and wouldn't have anticipated having. But the fact is we need to work with China in a wide range of areas in the Security Council and in many other areas as well. So without commenting on what China's current position is and what its current statements are, I think one of the things that's very important for the United States is to keep working with China on global strategic issues. Obviously, we work with China very closely on the issue of North Korea. We consulted closely with China on this UN resolution and events taking place in the Arab world. But China, which years ago was really relatively focused on its environment and East Asia, its neighborhood in East Asia, is now a major global strategic as well as an economic power. And therefore, it's important for the United States to work with China on North Africa and many other issues. And that really is we think of it and we take it for granted, but you couldn't have taken it for granted 15 years ago. China's role is a global role now, and we have to work with it as a global power.
Well, I'll come to the audience in just a few more minutes, but I'd like to come back to the issue that I briefly touched on, and that is in a world that's changing, in which, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said in a book that I was part of, there is a global political awakening taking place that is encouraged and fostered by the internet and new communications. There are obviously difficult questions for China and for China in its relationships with other countries as this process unfolds. And I'd like to just ask first the question that was raised by Google last week, when Google protested what it said was Chinese interference with the free exchange of email through its system. China issued a statement saying that wasn't so, denying that there'd been such intervention. But let me ask about the broader question. This is a world of open communications, as we all see every day, and yet there are limits that China tries to impose in the name of security on what you can search for, what you can get out of this technology. Ying, if you could just explain to us how China thinks about these questions of openness and stability at home in this new world.
I've not followed your the issue you raised. But I use Gmail, and my daughter, my husband, we've been. It's on my mobile, and we send email to each other every day. I don't see there's any difficulties, but there are laws and rules, and the internet activities need to be within the laws, like in any other country. And for the internet, China has 460 million internet users, 200 million bloggers. So it can't be a bad experience. My daughter spent hours on the internet every day. I worry for her eyes. I think it's internet is really a very important part of Chinese life. It's a very active society of its own. But I think you are implying to a broader issue of China's relationship with the West. I think there has long been a difficult issue, that is, from the Chinese point of view, are we out of the Cold War or not? Occasionally, China often hear the kind of analogy of China with the Cold War partners of the West. I don't think there is sufficient understanding outside China about the growth, about the changes, about the dynamic development in China. And on the other hand, I think China too needs to understand the Western world well. China needs to feel more comfortable, and I think feel more comfortable with the dialogue with the West. Both sides need to work to convince each other that we're meant for partnership, not for regime change, not for imposing, not for lecturing of each other. So I think that is something I hope the next decade will see happening. President Hu Jintao said when he was in France last year, he said, we hope the 21st century will be a century of cooperation. And I think it's a very ambitious hope for the world, because the world has not yet seen a century of cooperation. And to achieve that, we need partnership. And China probably is, for the first time, having an influence over the direction of the world. And China wants to be on the positive side. China wants to be on the cooperation, partnership side. So I think it's a learning process for China, and it is also a learning process for the West. So accept accept a newcomer who might be different.
I want to make sure that I understand what you were saying, because it's important. When you say that China feels sometimes that there's a Cold War framework, are you saying that you see in the West's response to this rising China that kind of an attempt to limit and contain?
I think there is a constant development that can be perceived in China as Cold War legacies, treating China as alien, seeing China as different. The messages I think China receives sometimes conflict with each other. I need to give you some examples, I think, to clarify myself. For example, we talked about European countries needing China's help at time of difficulties, and China responded positively. And at the same time, there were lots of expression of concern about China having ulterior motive on Europe. So for China, it's a confusing message. Should China help or shouldn't China? Should China stay away? And there is a worldwide acceptance that China has made economic progress. There's no question on that. But there is a constant questioning about whether China is correct politically, whether China has made progress politically, as if the economic progress is hanging in the air without the support of the political system in China. So that's what I meant. I think there need to be more understanding of each other, and then the barriers will come down.
Carl Bildt, I'd be interested in your views about these questions of openness and political change, and whether that wave is going to hit China, and how the rest of the world should look at that issue, that process.
I think it's fairly obvious that we're living in an interconnected world, and what happens in one part of the world affects every other part of the world, the one way or the other. I mean, it's not sort of 100% duplicated, but it's influenced, no question about that. But let me first say that I think we should be open. There are sort of behaviors of China in, say, cyberspace that we are very concerned with, be that the Chinese entities of the one way or the other, that haven't really accepted the rules of the games that have to be there in order to be part of the sort of interconnected world that we have. And that must be the subject of a far more intense dialogue than we've had so far. On the political system, that's always an interesting subject from the academic point of view. There's no question that China today is a far more open society than, say, to go back to the horrendous past 40 years ago. No question about that. But there is also a question mark whether the still relatively closed political system will be able to manage the tremendous change that is ongoing in Chinese society. I noticed that Premier Wen Jiabao in recent statements sort of started to indicate that after economic change, perhaps political change will follow. And that is, of course, the case. I mean, there is no nation in the world that has developed as fast in economic terms without developing its political system in the direction of greater openness. It has to some extent already happened in China. I'm quite convinced that more will happen. And I do think that this is also an issue where we should be able to have an open dialogue and sort of learn from the experiences. Sweden is a very unique place, not quite as unique as China perhaps, but we're all different. But they're all also, as we've learned, there are things that are in common, and there are lessons that can be learned, and there should be an open discussion about these things as well.
Bob Hormats, I think people around the world may have scratched their heads, not just in the last week, but over the last couple of years, wondering why Google, a private company, is fighting what it sees as a battle for openness, as opposed to the U.S. government doing that directly. Why should Google be on the front lines instead of Bob Hormats?
Well, let me just talk more of the more generic point that you've raised, and that is leaving aside Google's specific issues that it has raised on several occasions. There is a broader issue here, and Carl, I think, has put his finger on it, and that is, I think if you look at where China is today, it is very open in a wide range of areas. It's certainly much more open to foreign investment than 10 or 15 years ago. It's a major trading economy. It's becoming more integrated in the global financial system. It's playing a more constructive role on a number of environmental issues, as we saw in Cancun. But where the Chinese do have difficulty is in opening up in the area of cyberspace that Carl has mentioned. I think there is still a concern on the part of some Chinese leaders about how far to go in extending the freedom of the Internet to the robust exchange of information and ideas within China and across borders. I believe over a period of time that is likely to change, but there is still that reluctance to open up China, as many other countries are, to the open flow of ideas. The difficulty China is going to have in that area is it's very difficult to restrict access on the Internet to political ideas or social ideas and still have the open access you need for the flow of economic information or other kinds of information that are required to run a modern 21st century economy. There's one Internet, and once you start restricting parts of that Internet, you also can inadvertently affect or restrict other parts of the Internet which are critical to your economic strength in a globalized economy, which are critical to the exchange of information, which are critical to research cooperation across borders. And I think China's adjusting to this. I don't think we can expect that China's going to change overnight, but there's a much greater sense of sophistication today in China about the need for a more open flow of transborder information than there was maybe 5 years ago. But there's still a lot of apprehension in China about information flows, and that, I believe, it's an issue that the United States has raised with China, leaving aside the Google issue. The United States has raised Internet freedom with the Chinese on many occasions, in a constructive way, not a confrontational way, but a constructive way, and we will continue to do that. And I also think that even more important than what the United States says is that more and more Chinese have come to the conclusion that if they want to be a robust part of the global economy when it comes to knowledge-intensive industries, when it comes to transborder collaboration for research and development, that they are going to be pressing their government for greater access to the flow of information. And I think that is really what's going to change China, not us doing it, but Chinese themselves understanding the powerful role of the internet, the powerful role of information, and the importance of governments avoiding restrictions on that flow of information. That's the change that I believe is underway in China. Premier Wen mentioned this in his what they call work plan that's released every 5 years. And I think there will be a broader information flow. It won't be what we want necessarily, but it'll be much more active over the next 5 years than the last.
My takeaway fact from our discussion so far is that Ying uses Gmail. So, I'm assuming that she's going to be on the front lines of this herself. Yes, you wanted to.
I have to volunteer to comment about the assumption that there is a problem of access of information in China. I don't know how much Americans read about China. The Chinese read a lot more about U.S., comparatively speaking. I've been in Australia, I've been in London, and I found there are not many books about China in these countries' workshops, but in China you'll see lots of original books from these countries, lots of books about these countries. On the internet there is plenty of information about you. Chinese are not denied of information of the world, and 60 million Chinese visited abroad last year. 100 million foreigners visited China. 300,000 Taiwanese have a small town in Shanghai. This is an open society, open country. The assumption that China is blocking the Chinese people of the world is not true. I think the deficit, if we talk about information deficit, is on your side. You need to know more. You need to read more about China.
What's certainly true, what you say, that Chinese know a lot more about what's going on in the United States than Americans know about what's going on in China. I very much agree with that. And I think we should know a lot more about what's going on in China. I take this point entirely. I do think, however, that there are areas where the government of China does impose certain restrictions to the flow of information on certain items. I think that is something that it's China's decision. It does this for its own reasons. And we have commented on this on several occasions, not just Google issues, but broader issues. They're different subjects, they're different topics. But if you ask me, should Americans know more about what's going on in China than they do, and the very powerful changes that are taking place in China, many of which are for the better, then I would say, yes, we should know a lot more about that. I would certainly agree with that point.
Turn to Carl for a last. I should note, I think the issue that people raise isn't whether the Chinese have access to information about the U.S. Or Sweden, but whether they have access to information about their own country. I mean, I think that's when people talk about limits on information, that's more the question. Carl, you had your
Well, I was going to make roughly that point, as a matter of fact. Of course, it is a fact that there are more books about China in Sweden than books about Sweden in China, but that's a rather irrelevant point, have to be said. But the question is, and we all know that the Chinese government does restrict access to information. I think it's also a fair point to say that it's less than it was 30, 40 years ago. So evolution is hopefully going in the right direction. And the thing, and we've seen it in other similar examples, I mean, we all know that there are subjects concerning also fairly modern Chinese history. That it's, you can go to dinner in Beijing or Shanghai and you can discuss virtually every issue in the world. I don't dispute that. But there are certain issues also concerning fairly modern Chinese history that are virtually impossible to touch upon. And we know from experience from other countries that until a country can deal with every aspect of its own modern history, it is not truly comfortable in facing the future.
And
that we must all help with. I mean, that's
do you want to respond?
Leave to the Chinese to decide.
Yes, absolutely.
I think China has its unique culture, its way of looking at things. I could share with you a part of my own experience. My father was in confinement during the Cultural Revolution, and he suffered a lot. He came out and he refused to tell us who hurt him. He said, I don't want you to live in hatred in the rest of your life. And he said, we should come out of that. And you should remember that this country should never be in this kind of a mistake again. We should move on. So I think we have an attitude. China has gone through a lot in its history. Long feudal history and semi-colonization, disturbances, civil war, invasion, and mistakes like Cultural Revolution. And this country learns from its own mistakes and has a way of looking at things. We don't want to dig the graves. We want to move forward. We want to learn lessons. And we've learned lessons. And we are finally, I think for this country, after such a long period of difficulties, finally we are happy with ourselves. We have food on the table, and we've made a big cake. Maybe it's cake made of corns, unlike the cake in Japan is made of cream. But at least we have a cake, and now our next job is to make sure that the cake is fairly shared by the people. That's why the new 12th five-year program is shifting from focusing on GDP growth to the quality of the growth and to the welfare of the people. So I think this country is feeling more and more comfortable with its growth, and we don't want to let go this opportunity.
And I would just add, I think the 12th five-year plan is really a very important thing to read, because China is moving in the right direction. This goes back to one of the earlier points you made. China is moving in the right direction on a lot of issues. No country has improved the living standards of more people in a shorter period of time in history, in world history, than China has. So I'm not convinced that the points that we have made about restrictions on the access of information are permanent fixtures. I think China is evolving. China is much more global than it was 5 years ago, and it'll be much more global 5 years from now than it is today. And I do think that if you look at the village level, participatory governance is growing at a fairly rapid rate. So China, the one thing about China that is so compelling when you go there, I've been going there since the early 70s when I worked for Dr. Kissinger, and we started opening, is China does learn, and China does evolve in ways where if they make mistakes, they learn from mistakes and they improve. And I do think that anything, and the other point is, we shouldn't look at our relations with China as a zero-sum game. What benefits China in many ways in terms of economic growth can also be very beneficial to us and vice versa. So maintaining a dialogue, even where we have differences, and we do have differences with China on important issues that we mention very candidly, where there are differences, there are also procedures and institutional arrangements for resolving those, or at least managing them in an effective way. And I think that is what is so important about this relationship, that where there are these differences, there's also a process for either managing them effectively, or in some cases resolving them, or in some cases simply recognizing that we can't resolve them, but that over a period of time we should at least maintain a constructive dialogue. That in itself is very important for addressing the rising influence of China.
It's a good point to turn to the audience for questions. Keep them short. If you have a specific person you want to ask the question to, please direct it and identify yourself. Yes, Charles.
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform in London. A question mainly for Ying. We haven't really talked about Asian security at all, but if one goes to India or Vietnam or Singapore or Japan, every time one goes there, people there are more worried than they were on the previous visit about the rise of China, China's greater assertiveness in pursuing its interests in various island disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. They're worried about China having declared, or some Chinese people having declared, the South China Sea to be a core national interest. So the paradox, as I see it, is that just when these countries are becoming economically more integrated with China than ever before, in security terms, they're worried and they're asking the US to work with them, and they're getting closer to the US. So my question is it really in China's interest to be assertive in such a way that you are pushing some of your neighbors into a quasi-embryonic security alliance with the US?
Fu Ying, why don't you respond directly to that? Sorry.
Thank you. In China, when I make speech, I often ask the audience who thinks that China is the number 2 power in the world, and on most occasions there's no single hand up. The Chinese don't see themselves as a power in the world. We see ourselves as a developing country where our per capita GDP is ranking about 100 in the world. So we are still at the state of evolution, in the middle of a reform, trying to address the issues which is more challenging as we grow. With our neighbors, India, we have the border issue, but we have agreed to shelve it. This is probably has become most peaceful border because we have set up a system to make sure that tranquility prevails. And India is a very important partner. Soon they will come to the BRICS summit in Beijing, the head of government of India. So we don't see why we can't work with our neighbors, Vietnam and Indonesia. I think we've made miles since the 90s. I remember the tension in the 90s. We have to work with Vietnam about Cambodia. We've worked with Indonesia about resuming the diplomatic relations. And since then, we have become very close partners. I think Asia has one of the closest cooperation among the countries. But for the South China Sea, there was tension in the 90s, and I worked a lot on it when I was head of the Asian department. But the suggestion from Deng Xiaoping is more or less accepted by the countries around. That is to shelve the dispute and to see if we could enter into a cooperation. We tried very hard, which is not easy, but at least there was agreement that the disputes should be shelved. And we don't see there is a serious problem in the field. Maybe there are a bit more discussions of concern in the meetings, in the meeting rooms, not in the South China Sea itself. For core interest dispute, people try to find out who said that, where it came from. It shows that China does not see South China Sea is in serious, a real dispute now. There is a dispute, obviously, but there is also agreement to work on it at the same time, not allowing it to affect our relationship in the region. So I think I understand there is a concern. Of course, when China has grown strong, people wonder how China is going to use its power, and China needs to prove to its neighbors. It means for partnership, for cooperation, and China also needs to reach out more to the public in the neighboring countries to let people understand China better. But I think the objective of China is to have a peaceful environment. Otherwise, we ourselves will not be able to focus on our economic development. So stability, cooperation still is the objective for China and for the region, I think.
Hey, somebody said turn around, and I'm going to do that. And so turn to this gentleman. Let's bunch 2 questions, and then Senator Bennett. Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Gian Giacomo Migone, and I'm from Italy. I have a question that I want to address to the 3 of you. I would say that we're moving in the direction of a multipolar world. So my first question is, do you agree? Because multipolarism used to be a dirty word in Washington a couple of years ago. And now it has become almost conventional wisdom. And I mean, the three of you represent three poles in a sense, though we Europeans have to have some homework to doing, in getting our pole a little more cohesive. The second part of my question is, if you do agree that we are moving in this direction, Russia, Mercosur, African Union, and so on, do you have any thoughts as to how we should organize it? And we've all agreed until now, that the G2 is no issue. And also the G20 has its disadvantages, because how do you pick the 20s? So maybe we should think, in terms of the reform of the Security Council, which reflects, a situation that is of the far past.
I'm gonna take one more question from Senator Bennett, and then we'll turn back to the panel. I see so many hands up. I want to try to get to as many people as I can.
I live the cliche every time I go to China. I don't recognize it. The last time I was there, which was maybe 3 or 4 months ago, driving through Beijing, all of the brand new high-rise condos are very obvious, and I asked the question, who built these? Well, they're built on spec. I said, who lives in them? I was told nobody. And I asked the question, well, then why are they built? Well, real estate values are going up so rapidly in China that it's a good investment to have a condo, whether you live in it or not. And I said to myself, can you say condos in Miami? Can you say Las Vegas? Can you say Arizona? This was the core of the meltdown of the American financial system when the housing market collapsed because we had overproduction everywhere. When I was at Davos, somebody summarized it perfectly. He said, I knew we were in trouble when my cab driver said he owned 3 houses. Do you have a sense that there could be a serious financial problem in China when finally somebody will not buy the last tulip, or in this case, the last condo, and you have blocks and blocks of huge condo buildings with nobody living in them and nobody willing to buy them?
It's a great question. I want to take one more before I turn back this way. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Zania Dormandy, Chatham House. There's a discussion, if you will, there's an argument in the US that there's a split within China between the politics and the military. And there's a fear within with many people in the United States that there isn't effective communication between the two. There's 2 different factions. The political system in China is dividing from the military system, and that while we may want cooperation with China and the political system in China wanting cooperation with the United States, the military has a different opinion and a different position. And I'd be interested in all 3 panelists' thoughts on whether that's true or not and the implications if it is.
That's a rich mix. So we have governance, the G20, G2, or what. We have the question of whether China is hitting the tulip craze, overbuilding danger zone, and the question of whether there is a question that people ask more and more. Is there some gap between the PLA and what it wants and the Chinese government? So let's turn to the panel. Carl, why don't we start with you?
I think starting with the last question, I think it's fairly obvious, and you can take that in virtually every country. There's a difference between the outlook of, say, investment banker and the command of an armored brigade. That certainly applies to the United States, probably applies to Sweden insofar as we have any armored brigades these days. And I would be very surprised if it doesn't apply to China either. China has the 2nd largest defense budget in the world. It has the major defense budget that is increasing larger than or faster than anyone else. Of course, military men have their own mindset, and we should not be surprised. But I think that argues in favor of engaging with them as well. And I think one of the most fascinating things that we've seen in China during the last few years is that the debate on foreign and security policy issues has been somewhat more diversified. You can hear the different voices. They are the natural voices representing the different constituencies, and we must be prepared to engage with all of them. But the fact that there are different constituencies representing different outlooks shows that China is developing perhaps as a normal country, because that's the way it is in our countries as well. But it's different, and it's new, and they are powerful.
Madam Vice Minister, what are your thoughts about those, any and all of those three?
First, about the military, about different views, different voices. I was in a party school, and I would attend lectures with very diverse views. One day, somebody comes in to say U.S. is a friend. The next day, somebody comes in to say U.S. is an enemy. You should always be on guard. The military professors also have different views when they come to give lectures, very different lectures. The outside world, especially the West, think China has no freedom of speech. But when you hear different views, you get worried. But there has always been different views. Maybe because of the language barrier, you don't hear, or you don't come with ears. I think in China it's impossible to have 1.3 billion people staying on one line. There are always diversified views, but for the army, you can't deny the army professors expressing their views. But the army has a policy which is defensive, which follows the party line. I don't think there is a split between the army and the government. I understand the view comes from probably two reasons. One is the military, the strategic dialogue was not resuming, while the political dialogue was very active. But Secretary Gates came to China, so the relationship is resuming. But for the army, there is this sense of how to say, China is the only one country of the 5 permanent members of Security Council which is under sanction of its fellow member of the Security Council. China is expected to work with the U.S., with EU on sanctions on North Korea, on Iran, and now Libya, and China itself is under sanction. So it's a very awkward situation. Chinese people are very polite. The Chinese army people are even more polite. Doesn't mean they don't think. They think. They have their own views, and they want to have dialogue. They've been having close dialogue with the American Defense Force for a long time, but at the same time, U.S. sells arms to Taiwan. So for them, I think I understand the agony. I understand the difficulties. I'm often invited to speak to the army functions, and they raise very critical questions to me, to the diplomats. And the other reason this idea came was probably because Gates came on the day the new weapon, new fighter was tested, and it was perceived as a deliberate act. But anybody with a bit of knowledge of technology would know that a diplomatic visit by a Secretary of Defense can be arranged in 2 months' time, but the testing of flight is planned a lot longer, and it needs lots of natural conditions. So I think the interpretation is a reflection of the kind of thinking some people has about China. I wouldn't. I think people are reading too much out of it, but it is true that the comfort level needs to be raised between the two military to militaries. Imagine if U.S. is under sanction by China, how would you feel? You never had that experience, so you don't know. But please do try to understand the feeling of the other side. Let me see, there are other questions. Should I go on?
We knew that was a good. Unless you want to
have a break.
I'll turn to Bob Hormats, and maybe Bob, you could speak to this question that was implicit in Senator Bennett's question about whether we're looking at an overheating or not a bubble problem in China.
Okay, well, let me just touch first on the multipolar world question. I mean, it is a multipolar world, but a multipolar world also creates opportunity for a multi-partner world. And I think increasingly that's the right way of looking at it. Surely there are more centers of power today than there were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. During the Cold War, there were essentially two centers of power, Moscow and Washington, or the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now we have a number of centers of power. I don't look at that as a bad thing. It seems to me that if we look at these, as I say, as potential partners in dealing with trade or financial or environmental or other issues, that's the world of the 21st century, to look at ways of developing these partnerships. The G20 is one, but we need to do it in a whole range of institutions. The OECD is an example. It's in Paris, not very far from here. The OECD, which was traditionally seen, particularly after World War II, as a very Western-centered institution, now has an outreach program for China, India, Brazil, and is headed by a Mexican. That's a really interesting change. Many institutions now, if they're going to be successful, have to include these other centers of economic and political power in them, or they won't be seen as legitimate internationally, and they won't achieve very much in the way of real objectives. On Senator Bennett's point, there is traditionally, from time to time in China, little mini bubbles. There are, and some of them are in the real estate area, as he's correctly pointed out. But I will say one thing, and that is that the people who run the Chinese economy, the People's Bank of China, Governor Zhou Xiaochuan, the Minister of Finance, the economic team, are very sophisticated about managing these issues of real estate bubbles and inflation. If you read Premier Wen's work plan for the next several years, next 5 years, he underscores that the biggest single threat to the economy is inflation. And the government of China has gone through these periods before and has handled them, I think, remarkably well. One of the things we really have to recognize about China is they have a very sophisticated economic team. They understand inflation. Historically, inflation, if you go back before the revolution, historically inflation has been a very destabilizing force in China. And the Chinese government has made a major effort when they see inflation to arrest it, to slow it down before it becomes destabilizing. And therefore, I think they're very much on top of the situation, although, as I say, there are these mini bubbles, primarily in Beijing and Shanghai, not so much throughout the rest of the country. So they're aware of it, and I think they're going to deal with it. And the last point, the military point, I just want to make one point. I don't want to get into some speculation as to issues internally in China. I have enough issues trying to understand what's going on within the United States. But I do think that the Gates visit was very important, and increasing cooperation between and contacts between the American military and the Chinese military is a very good idea. If you look, I'll give you an example. If you look at Egypt, one of the reasons we've been able to have a dialogue with the Egyptian military during this period is that a lot of these people studied in the United States, and those people who didn't study in the United States had very good contacts with the American military. And building confidence between the United States and China over the long run is going to require not simply a political dialogue, which we have got in the strategic and economic dialogue and other things, or these economic discussions which take place on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis, but a lot more visits by our military to China, China's military to the United States. So, and that's part of a confidence-building exercise, which I think is critically important to closer cooperation and stability over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think the Gates visit was a very important part of that. And, of course, we welcome senior Chinese military leaders to Washington and hope there'll be more and more of them, as well as people at the at lower levels, too. So they get to know one another, they get to understand one another, and they develop a dialogue.
But try 4 questions this time, starting with this gentleman and then 2 rows down, and then this gentleman here, and then, yes, madam, there.
Michael Hansen is my name, from Sweden. The Chinese people and nation is craving for international respect. Isn't that so? We would so much like to accommodate you, but there is one difference between us that we have to sort up first. We call censorships censorships. If we could have a straight dialogue concerning that, I'm sure that the respect would be much more visible after having had such a discussion. Madam, what do you think about that?
Let's hold that for a minute, sir.
Ian Conn, I'm with BP. I look after Europe and Asia, and I really want to start with an observation and then turn it into a question. I mean, the question tonight is strategic competition inevitable? And something that you've got choice over, by definition, isn't inevitable. And I'm intrigued by this conversation because it seems to me we have a spectrum from strategic competition at one end to strategic cooperation at the other. And if you're trying to get to know someone, you tend to focus on the things that you can talk about or have in common. And if you don't want to get to know someone, you tend to either ignore them or talk about the things that you are finding to be fundamentally different. And I find most of this conversation tonight focused on difference rather than commonality, yet when I see in the matter of energy and lots of other things, there is huge basis for commonality. So my question to the panel really is, are we avoiding being honest with each other that there isn't enough will for strategic cooperation? Because it seems to me patently obvious from where I stand as an energy person that there is huge basis for strategic cooperation. And if we cooperate, we'll learn about each other and we create a virtuous dynamic in cooperation. If we choose to go the other route, which is a perfectly valid choice, we will go the other route. So my question to the panel is there really sufficient will for strategic cooperation, or are we actually going through the motions?
Sure.
Andrew Michta, Rhodes College. Very brief question to all 3 panelists, if I may. As I listen for an hour and a half to this discussion, there's one country that has not been mentioned once. It happens to be to the east of Carl's homeland, happens to be to the north of you, Madam Minister, and I think Sarah Palin can see it from her house, so it's close to us as well. Not a word about Russia, how it figures into the so-called geostrategic competition. So we are implicitly front-loading the discussion that there's one very significant Eurasian power that's not even in the room as we're talking about it. And I'd like for the panelists to address how Russia figures into the discussion, critical for energy issues, critical for energy, and I think very important for us in Central Asia and the current operations. Thank you.
Madam.
I'm a journalist with the EU Observer here in Brussels. And my question is directed both to Ms. Ying and to Mr. Bildt regarding Libya, and yesterday the NATO ambassadors agreeing on the enforcement of the no-fly zone by NATO. So I was wondering what China's view is, and of course what Sweden, a non-NATO member but strong NATO ally, is on this. Thank you.
So again, we have a question about openness, Madam Vice Minister. pointed to you. Is this really a question, when we come down to it, of a lack of political will to do what's obvious and necessary? What about Russia? And some more focus on Libya. So again, why don't we start with you, Carl?
Well, last question, perhaps somewhat outside this particular panel, but just to say that air operations is serious business and can't be conducted in a serious way without a serious chain of command, period. And then you might look around and see who can supply a serious command chain, and the choice is fairly limited. That's the way it is. Otherwise, it's not a serious operation. But let me just address the question whether we are focusing too much on what unites us or what divides us. I would argue that what we are talking about is management of strategic change. It is a huge change that's happening with China and its impact all over the world. It's not only China, it's also other rising powers, but it's primarily China. That must be managed in a dialogue. That dialogue, I think, having been through some of these meetings, tends to perhaps be, it's not that it's focusing too much on what divides. Sometimes it's focused too little on what divides. That we are too kind to each other. That diplomacy takes dominance. Diplomacy in that sort of way takes dominance over really the honest dialogue. Of course, we are aware, I think, on the European side, American side, and Chinese side, on how much we have in common and how much this common responsibility for managing, be that the global economy or be that climate change. But we also know that we can't really do it if we don't discuss fairly openly the different perspectives that are there, coming out of the different geographies, the different economies, the different historical experiences. Or take the issue that we've been touching upon, the cyberspace issues. It doesn't go away if we don't address it. But it will hit us all if we don't address it. And if we then don't address it, then all of the sort of glossy, nice things that we can create can be eroded by the fact that there are things that we are not addressing. So a proper relationship, yes, of course. It is based on the fact that we live on the same planet. And I was going to say live even more on the same planet, but that's fairly obvious. But we will be more linked to each other. That's fairly obvious. But that makes it also important that we focus on the issues where perspectives are different, because otherwise it's a very shallow relationships, and a shallow relationship won't last. And a shallow relationship with China is not what the world needs today.
Fu Ying.
I'd like to start from the censorship one and then go through the rest, which I missed. For the censorship, for some countries, the censorship is about terrorism. For others, maybe about racism. And for some, it's about subversion. I think countries have laws for different reasons against different things. A Chinese student got arrested shouting at the airport in New York to his girlfriend. He wouldn't get arrested if he did it in China at the airport. Lots of Chinese shout at each other. I think the countries are sensitive about things for different reasons, probably for good reason. I don't think it's easy to manage the internet at this time with the technology. I think it's a challenge for all countries, all governments, balancing the freedom at the same time preventing the damage. In China, there is a very difficult question regarding how much you control the children from viewing the internet. Parents think there should be more control, but the scholars think that you shouldn't. You should leave it for the children to decide. I think we are in a changing world, and we are confronting with different challenges, but there is surely a need to provide safety for the society. I think that's the responsibility for all governments. In China, a man was sentenced to 7 years because of a internet photo he put. He crafted a photo from CNN or from somewhere about a red-clothed girl being stoned to death, and he crafted and say is and he said it happened in Guangzhou and sent it to Xinjiang and stirred up ethnic hatred. And it was wrong not to censor it in the first place. So I think you should leave the benefit of doubt that countries and people have their reason and have their way of developing themselves. It is wrong to believe that the Chinese government is trying to prevent people from having the access of information. Now about the question of housing, it is true that there are houses which were sold. There's no lights on in the evening, but there are not many. There are not many. If you come to Beijing, 12 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the evening, most of the houses have lights. In China, we still have half of the population in the rural area. So the industrialization, urbanization in China is at a very early stage. So we're far from the problem that is plaguing the United States. But there is the problem in China is the price of the houses. The complaint is about the expense. The houses are getting more expensive. And at the National People's Congress, normally before March, it's a time people express their concerns. Last year it was education, it was medical care, and this year it's a housing price. And that's why at the new 5-year program, there is a clear plan to increase the subsidized housing. Subsidized housing used to be offered during the planned economy time. With the market economy, we put all the houses on the market. Now we realize not everybody can afford. So we come back to the scheme of subsidized housing. Hopefully that will help. I think the plan is to provide 36 million more families with subsidized housing. So I thank you for worrying for China, but for inflation, yes, inflation is also a concern. But as Bob said, that China is working very hard on it. Now about the will of a strategic cooperation, I think there is, and because we don't have other choice. For the multipolar world, China has always advocated for multipolar world. But recently, you may notice that we're using more the term multilateralism instead of multipolarism, because the developing countries, the Africans, the Asians, and came to ask, where are we in this multipolar world? We realized that it should be more inclusive. So we talk more about multilateralism, and which is the face of the world we see now. I think I've answered them all.
Bob Hormats.
Okay, let me just first discuss this question of whether we're focusing too much on differences and not enough on areas of common interest. I think Carl put his finger on it. There are clearly areas where there are differences of opinion. We have very different political systems between China and the U.S. and China and Europe. In some cases, we have very different views on issues related to freedom of information. We have differences on issues related to human rights. And we speak of them, I think, very candidly to one another, as one would do where we have respect for one another. And I remember going to China early on when Dr. Kissinger was opening up, and we had conversations with Premier Zhou Enlai. And the Chinese never, ever complained when we had candid conversations about differences. They didn't always agree with us, and we didn't always agree with them. But Zhou Enlai repeatedly said, if two great powers are sitting down with one another, they should be candid about where they agree and where they disagree. And I think that candor has characterized the relationship. There's a difference between being candid and being confrontational. And one of the points that I think is very important is that neither side, even when we've had differences, have put these in a confrontational context. There have been very frank discussions about differences from time to time. But the general view of both sides is that where we have them, we should acknowledge them and work them out where we can work them out. If we can't work them out, then try to manage them. The broader point is that there are a great many more areas where we have common interests than areas in which there are differences. And I just will go through them very quickly. We cannot resolve global environmental issues without cooperation between the United States and China. We were not able to deal with we wouldn't have been able to deal with the financial situation that we confronted as well as the world did without cooperation between the United States and China. There are any number of other issues. Dealing with piracy in the Indian Ocean, a lot of cooperation between the United States and China. We're working very closely on the situation in North Korea. We don't necessarily agree on every point, but China has played a very constructive role in dealing with those issues. So I think that the dialogue, the strategic and economic dialogue, and the meetings, and I've had the opportunity to sit on our meetings between President Obama and President Hu Jintao on 3 occasions. All of them are focused on areas where we disagree, and President Hu will bring up areas of disagreement, President Obama will bring them up, but even where those exist, the objective is to find ways of managing them. And I think there's a great deal more emphasis on cooperation than confrontation in areas where our interests converge than on those where they diverge. And let me just touch briefly on Russia, since I came from Moscow yesterday and feel that I should address this at least for a moment. The notion of the reset button that was so famously mentioned at the beginning of this administration. There is a very interesting thing going on, and that is the fact is that the United States is working with Russia in a way where the old tensions of the Cold War may still exist in the minds of some people on the Russian side and the American side. And there are people who bring these issues up from time to time. That is certainly true. But again, the whole thrust of relations between President Obama and President Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin are designed to try to narrow differences. And the point I want to illustrate this with is the following, and that is our goal, and the EU's goal also, is to have Russia join the World Trade Organization, the WTO. We've been working with the Russians on this. China joined the WTO years ago under the leadership of, largely driven by Premier Zhu Rongji. And the interesting thing, and if you put this all in a historical context, during the Cold War, there was a question, how would the Cold War end? Would it end in a hot war? Would it end in a nuclear war? Or would it end some other way? The answer is that the Cold War ended not with a hot war, not with a nuclear war, but with the former adversaries of the United States and Europe becoming part of the global system, joining the IMF, joining the World Bank, joining, in many cases, the World Trade Organization, working with the global institutions that were established in the 1940s and 1950s, becoming part of, and in largely a very constructive part of the global system. So if you want to look at history and put what we're discussing now in the broader context of global history, there has been an integration into the global economic system that could not have been dreamt of in the 1970s during the height of the Cold War. But that the fact is, most countries realize that they have a great deal more to gain working together economically in those institutions than confronting one another. And the fact that we're much more integrated today leads me to conclude not that we can avoid problems or differences. They are going to exist with big countries. They're certainly going to exist. But that there is a framework for resolving them. And if you take the spirit that enabled the integration of these economies, these countries, into the global system in the 1990s and the current century, then I think you can conclude that not that all issues are going to be resolved quickly or easily. They won't be. But there's a process underway. There's a sort of a sweep of history that leads to greater integration and a greater process of problem solving than could have been imagined 20 years ago.
With Bob Hormats, that's a nice way to end it. Very upbeat. With apologies to the people that I wasn't able to call. It's after 11 o'clock. My mother always told me it's impolite to keep guests after 11. And we've pushed our panel hard. So I apologize to the people who had their hands raised for a long time who I didn't get to. But I found this fascinating. Join me, please, in thanking the panel.